Liberia's legislative crisis and the election of Richard Koon as Speaker, a cautionary tale of judicial defiance, executive overreach, and Africa's struggle with separation of powers. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where truth is fearless and silence is not an option. When justice is ignored and power defies the Constitution, democracy trembles. This is not just Liberia's crisis, it's Africa's warning. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. The recent resignation of Fonati Koffa as Speaker of Liberia's House of Representatives and the subsequent election of Representative Richard Koon mark a critical juncture in Liberia's democratic trajectory. Koffa's resignation, prompted by the executive branch's refusal to enforce a Supreme Court ruling affirming his speakership, exposes an alarming pattern of constitutional defiance. Koon's ascension, although now legal, is marred by its origins in judicial defiance and raises broader concerns about the consolidation of power in Liberia's post-Wee political environment under President Joseph Boakai. This development is emblematic of a broader African governance challenge, the fragility of democratic institutions in the face of executive manipulation and legislative compromise. From Kenya to Nigeria, Ghana to Sierra Leone, similar trends reveal a troubling pattern where political expediency often supersedes constitutional order. Background: a constitutional crisis. Ignored Representative Fonati Koffa's removal as Speaker did not follow the traditional legislative process. It was orchestrated by the majority bloc in the House, which, despite a Supreme Court ruling affirming Koffa's legitimacy, refused to recognize his authority. The executive branch, led by President Joseph Boakai, further undermined this ruling by openly endorsing the majority bloc and operating with a functional quorum, as reported by Front Page Africa, May 13, 2025. The Supreme Court made a clarification. It said, Fonati is the Speaker. Any other thing that happened was illegal. Fonati Koffa, in his resignation speech. Front Page Africa. The crisis escalated as members of the majority bloc threatened impeachment against Supreme Court justices, withheld salaries from suspended MPs, and allegedly prepared for violent confrontations at the Capitol. The Supreme Court later declared these actions illegal, but by then the political damage was done. Analysis: judicial authority undermined, legislative independence threatened. The refusal of the executive to enforce the Supreme Court's verdict is a constitutional affront. Liberia's constitution, like those in most African democracies, vests final interpretive authority in the judiciary. President Boakai's refusal to fully implement the ruling reflects executive contempt for judicial independence. This situation echoes similar crises elsewhere on the continent. Kenya. In 2017, President Uhuru Kenyatta dismissed a Supreme Court decision annulling his election, stating, "We have a problem with our judiciary," triggering concerns over rule of law. Nigeria. In 2019, the removal of Chief Justice Walter Onnoghen by President Buhari was widely seen as executive interference in judicial affairs. Sierra Leone. Allegations abound that President Bio's government has selectively enforced court orders, especially against opposition figures and critical civil society groups. In each case, judicial defiance by the executive eroded public trust and emboldened ruling majorities to act with impunity. Legislative complicity and the rise of Richard Koon. Richard Koon's election, while procedurally constitutional, lacks moral legitimacy. For months, Koon presided over an illegal legislative session as determined by the Supreme Court and actively participated in the marginalization of his rivals. His eventual victory, coming only after the forced resignation of a legally affirmed speaker, raises uncomfortable questions. Does legality override legitimacy? What precedent does this set for constitutional compliance in the legislature? While Koon's supporters 47 lawmakers, according to Front Page Africa, celebrate his elevation. Dissenting voices, including Reppers Musa Bility of the Rule of Law Caucus, warn that this sets a dangerous precedent for Liberia's fledgling democracy. Africa-wide perspective, the fragile balance of power. Liberia is not alone in its legislative dysfunction. The tension between the executive and parliament is a recurring theme across the continent. Country recent power struggles. Ghana. Executive dominance challenged by hung parliament after 2020 elections. Uganda parliament passed constitutional amendments under duress, including removal of age limits. Zimbabwe judiciary perceived as subservient to ZANU-PF's executive control. Sierra Leone 2023 elections saw parliament and judiciary clash over election results and legality. The underlying cause in most cases is institutional weakness. Despite formal democratic structures, the lack of enforcement mechanisms and the personalization of power means the executive often acts above the law. The Koffa resignation, a pragmatic retreat or strategic sacrifice. Koffa's resignation, while principled, was also pragmatic. With intelligence of potential violence at the capital and an increasingly isolated bloc of allies, he chose to step aside, possibly to preserve his legacy and protect his colleagues. He rejected claims of being paid off and instead called for international investigators into the Capitol fire incident, signaling his commitment to rule of law even in defeat. His upcoming book, From 1 to 73, The Conspiracy at the Capitol, promises to detail the behind-the-scenes negotiations, political betrayals, and constitutional violations during the 7-month standoff. It may become a critical document for future reform advocates. Forward-looking, what's next for Liberia's democracy? The election of Richard Koon does not mark the end of Liberia's constitutional crisis. It merely shifts the battlefield. Key questions. Moving forward. 1. Will Speaker Koon respect and uphold Supreme Court decisions moving forward? 2. Can Deputy Speaker Thomas Fowler restore trust and procedural discipline to the House? 3. Will President Boakai recalibrate his relationship with the legislature and judiciary to reflect constitutional boundaries? 4. What reforms will be proposed to prevent future breakdowns in legislative leadership? If Liberia fails to address these institutional failures, it risks deeper polarization, potential legislative boycotts, and weakened public trust in democratic processes. 7. Lessons for the African continent. The Koffa Koon saga is more than a domestic Liberian dispute. It is a cautionary tale for all African democracies. Separation of powers must be respected. When one branch defies another, the rule of law collapses. Judicial authority must be enforced. Court decisions are not advisory, they are binding. Political expediency cannot replace constitutionalism. Short-term gains often breed long-term instability. As Africa continues its democratic experiment, Liberia's crisis offers valuable lessons on the need to strengthen institutions, insulate them from political pressure, and ensure accountability at all levels of government. The bigger picture, continental integration and institutional reforms. Regional bodies like ECOWAS and the African Union, AU, must play a more proactive role in upholding constitutional order. The African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, for instance, should be reactivated to monitor democratic integrity, not just elections. Just as ECOWAS acted decisively in the Gambia in 2017, it must be willing to diplomatically censure or mediate in crises where judicial rulings are disregarded, as in Liberia today. The role of civil society and the media in safeguarding constitutionalism. In Liberia, as in many African nations, the responsibility of holding public officials accountable increasingly falls on civil society organizations, CSOs, and independent media outlets. During the 7-month legislative standoff, Civil society actors, such as the Center for Transparency and Accountability in Liberia, CENTAL, and the Institute for Research and Democratic Development, IREDD, raised alarm bells about the dangers of institutional paralysis. These groups emphasized that ignoring court orders sets a dangerous precedent that could erode public confidence in both governance and the electoral process. Independent media houses, particularly Front Page Africa, The Daylight, and OKFM, also played a pivotal role in shaping public discourse. By providing real-time updates, publishing court interpretations, and hosting debates, they ensured that the public remained informed even as official channels often blurred the lines between legality and loyalty. However, these institutions themselves are under threat. The intimidation of journalists, politicization of media licensing, and economic pressure through the denial of advertising revenue continue to undermine press freedom. A report by Reporters Without Borders, RSF, in 2024 ranked Liberia 75th globally in press freedom, warning of increasing executive hostility toward dissenting voices. Liberia's democracy will remain fragile unless civil society and the media are protected, empowered, and institutionally recognized as watchdogs, not enemies of the state. The regional ripple effects, ECOWAS on the spot. Liberia's constitutional turbulence reverberates beyond its borders. As a founding member of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, the country is expected to uphold the bloc's democratic principles as enshrined in the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, 2001. This protocol obliges member states to respect the separation of powers, judicial independence, and constitutional term limits. However, the recent silence of ECOWAS regarding the defiance of Liberia's Supreme Court is deafening. Critics argue that ECOWAS's muted response reflects a broader regional trend of strategic quietism, where member states are reluctant to confront their peers, fearing backlash or exposing their own democratic weaknesses. Yet, inaction comes with consequences. Liberia's situation adds to a growing list of democratic regressions in the region, including Guinea 2021 coup, following constitutional manipulation by Alpha Conde, Mali and Burkina Faso, two military coups each between 2020 and 2023, Senegal, pre-election tension in 2024 over delayed elections and controversial candidacy debates. If ECOWAS fails to act firmly and consistently, it risks becoming irrelevant in the face of deepening authoritarianism and constitutional erosion across West Africa. Youth disillusionment and the risk of political apathy. One of the most alarming consequences of prolonged political instability is the erosion of public faith, especially among youth. In Liberia, over 60% of the population is under 25. This demographic, already burdened by high unemployment, poor education infrastructure, and rising living costs, views political dysfunction as a betrayal of their future. The debacle in the House has only widened this trust deficit. A recent youth survey conducted by NAMOTE, Partners for Democratic Development, found that 71% of young respondents believe elected officials prioritize personal interest over national development. Many also expressed frustration that their participation in the 2023 elections appears meaningless in the face of judicially defied political outcomes. If left unchecked, this disillusionment could manifest in two dangerous directions: widespread political apathy, leading to low voter turnout and disengagement from civic duties. Radicalization, with some youths potentially turning to populist or even anti-democratic movements as an expression of resistance. The government, civil society, and development partners must act urgently to re-engage the youth through civic education, political dialogue, and genuine inclusion in governance reform processes. Economic implications, stability versus investor confidence. While the constitutional crisis may appear purely political, its economic repercussions are already emerging. Liberia's fragile post-war economy, highly dependent on foreign aid, donor confidence, and natural resource exports, is sensitive to political instability. The prolonged legislative paralysis affected budget approvals and disbursement, delaying key government projects. Foreign investor confidence, with at least two international firms reportedly pausing expansion plans in the extractive sector. Public sector wage payments, particularly for MPs and their staff, who went unpaid for months. The World Bank's 2025 economic update for Liberia noted that governance uncertainty poses significant downside risks to Liberia's recovery efforts, with inflation hovering around 12% and food insecurity affecting over 40% of households. Further instability may deter not just investors but also international donors. The new speaker, Richard Koon, must now not only unify the House, but also urgently restore public and investor confidence by passing key economic reforms and ensuring transparency in governance. Gender and power dynamics in Liberian politics. Another largely overlooked angle in this crisis is the gender imbalance in Liberia's political leadership. The speaker contest between Koffa, Bility, and Koon was exclusively male, reflecting the broader marginalization of women in Liberia's decision-making spaces. Despite years of advocacy and post-Ellen Johnson Sirleaf optimism, women currently hold less than 12% of seats in the House of Representatives. Several female lawmakers have expressed frustration with being sidelined during the standoff and committee allocation process. Representative Rosanna Shack, for example, lamented that the fight for the speakership was more about male ego and less about national interest. For Liberia to fully democratize, gender equity must be embedded into parliamentary leadership structures, legislative reforms, and party nominations. Civil society and international partners must renew pressure for electoral reforms that mandate minimum gender quotas in leadership positions. Constitutional reforms, a necessity, not a choice. The crisis has highlighted serious structural weaknesses in Liberia's constitutional and legislative framework. While the Constitution provides for checks and balances, its enforcement mechanisms, particularly concerning judicial rulings and legislative leadership disputes, are vague and easily manipulated. Legal scholars and former Chief Justice Gloria Musa Scott have long argued for a constitutional review to clarify the limits of executive influence over the legislature, codify the supremacy and enforceability of Supreme Court rulings, define mechanisms for legislative dispute resolution without resorting to external political influence. This is a pivotal moment for Liberia to consider launching a constitutional review commission, similar to what Kenya implemented in the early 2000s after political gridlock and public disillusionment. A moment of reckoning for Liberia and West Africa. The resignation of Fonati Koffa, the election of Richard Koon, and the constitutional defiance by the executive branch represent more than a domestic crisis. They serve as a stress test of democratic resilience in post-conflict Liberia. Whether this becomes a turning point or a cautionary chapter will depend on the actions taken in the coming months by lawmakers, civil society, regional institutions, and President Joseph Boakai himself. As Liberia prepares for the next legislative session under Speaker Koon, the country and the continent must ask, is democracy in West Africa still a system of laws, or has it become a system of loyalties? The legal community's silence and its implications. One of the more puzzling dynamics during the constitutional standoff in Liberia's House of Representatives was the relative silence of the legal fraternity, particularly the Liberian National Bar Association, LNBA, whose voice was notably muted. While some individual lawyers issued statements supporting the Supreme Court's ruling, the bar as an institution failed to strongly condemn the executive's defiance or the legislature's ongoing noncompliance. This silence, analysts argue, erodes the moral authority of the legal profession and compromises the foundational tenets of Liberia's post war legal revival. As pointed out by constitutional expert Claude Tiawan, when lawyers cower in the face of executive intimidation, democracy suffers. In a functioning rule of law environment, bar associations act as institutional firewalls, speaking out when any branch of government oversteps its constitutional boundaries. This situation calls for a reinvigoration of professional legal advocacy in Liberia, including strengthening the independence and public engagement role of the LNBA, encouraging law faculties at the University of Liberia and other institutions to host public forums and debates on constitutional crises, creating legal awareness programs that empower citizens to understand the implications of Supreme Court defiance. Without a vibrant legal voice, the very essence of constitutionalism risks being hollowed out, and precedent is set for future defiance without legal consequences. Role of international partners and donor leverage. Liberia's international partners, particularly the United States, European Union, United Nations, and ECOWAS, have played a historically vital role in stabilizing Liberia's post-war governance. Yet, their response to this particular legislative crisis has been measured and cautious. No strong diplomatic statements were issued condemning the failure to implement the Supreme Court ruling. Instead, development partners continued technical support, humanitarian aid, and governance programming as though business were proceeding normally. This reluctance to apply political pressure is viewed by many civil society organizations as a missed opportunity to reinforce democratic accountability. According to Ibrahim Nye, a political analyst with the Liberia Political Accountability Network, LPAN, development partners should have conditioned certain budget support packages on constitutional compliance. This is not about politics, it's about legal order. Liberia remains heavily dependent on international aid. As such, foreign governments and multilateral agencies have leverage, should they choose to use it. Moving forward, partners must explicitly link aid disbursement to measurable governance indicators, including rule of law adherence. Provide support for independent judicial enforcement mechanisms. Fund civil society watchdogs to monitor legislative and executive actions against court rulings. International actors must understand that silence in moments of democratic regression is interpreted not as neutrality, but as tacit endorsement. The Boakai administration's legitimacy dilemma. President Joseph Boakai assumed office in 2024 amid high hopes for renewal and reform following the turbulent final years of George Weah's presidency. His campaign emphasized integrity, unity, and national healing. However, his perceived alignment with the majority bloc and disregard for judicial authority have put his credibility at risk. Critics argue that the president, either by strategic calculation or leadership inertia, failed to seize a pivotal moment to strengthen Liberia's democratic institutions. His refusal to enforce the Supreme Court ruling and instead deal with the majority bloc reflects a short-term political trade-off at the expense of long-term constitutional integrity. As Boakai's presidency enters its second year, he must now contend with mounting internal dissent, even among pro-government lawmakers disillusioned by the handling of committee assignments, growing public skepticism, particularly from youth and civil society organizations, potential international scrutiny, especially as governance and justice become key benchmarks for future donor assistance and investment flows. If the Boakai administration wishes to salvage its reformist reputation, it must take immediate steps to publicly reaffirm its commitment to judicial independence, encourage constitutional reforms that safeguard legislative autonomy, promote reconciliation within the House, and demonstrate nonpartisanship in legislative dealings. The threat of political violence, a warning from the Capitol fire. One of the most disturbing undercurrents in this saga was the intelligence indicating potential violence at the Capitol, which Speaker Koffa cited as a major reason for his resignation. Although details remain scant, the Capitol building fire and the continued detention of staff members allegedly linked to it remain a flashpoint for suspicion, fear, and potential unrest. Koffa's appeal for international investigators to handle the matter is not just a call for impartiality, it is an indictment of the Liberian justice system's perceived politicization. The case is already being interpreted in some quarters as a tool of coercion, possibly used to intimidate or silence dissenters within the House. In fragile democracies like Liberia, politicized criminal investigations can quickly escalate into full-blown instability. The country's 14-year civil war, sparked in part by impunity and politicized justice, is a grim reminder of what can happen when justice becomes a political weapon. To prevent further deterioration, Liberia must invite independent regional or international forensic experts to investigate the Capitol incident, ensure transparent judicial proceedings for those detained, avoid using criminal allegations to settle political scores. Failure to address these concerns risks dragging the country back into a cycle of retribution, mistrust, and, potentially, unrest. Rebuilding parliamentary legitimacy, the Koon challenge. Now legally confirmed as Speaker, Richard Koon inherits a deeply fractured House and a severely damaged institutional reputation. His task is immense, but not impossible. The legitimacy of his speakership will depend not on the votes he received, but on the leadership he now demonstrates. Among his top priorities should be healing the divide within the legislature through inclusive committee restructuring and reconciliation forums, engaging the public by publishing a legislative agenda focused on bread and butter issues such as food security, infrastructure, and youth employment, strengthening transparency, including regular legislative briefings, public access to parliamentary proceedings, and financial accountability mechanisms. Respecting judicial authority, especially in the enforcement of Supreme Court rulings related to parliamentary conduct. Koon's performance over the next few months will determine whether his speakership ushers in a new era of legislative integrity or merely cements the normalization of political expediency over constitutional order. Pan-African Reflections: Is Africa's constitutional order in retreat? Liberia's current crisis is part of a disturbing continental trend, the systematic weakening of constitutional governance. Across Africa, courts are increasingly being ignored, co-opted, or intimidated. Parliaments are reduced to rubber stamps, and executives are consolidating power, often with the complicity of pliant legislators. A 2025 Afrobarometer survey found that only 38% of Africans believe their leaders usually obey court decisions. Over 50% believe their parliaments do not represent their interests. Nearly 70% prefer democracy, yet trust in democratic institutions is waning. If African democracies are to survive the 21st century, institutional strengthening must become the new revolution. It will no longer be enough to hold elections or draft constitutions. Countries must ensure those constitutions are respected, enforced, and protected from political capture. Lessons from other African democracies. Comparative case studies. To truly grasp the gravity of Liberia's crisis and its implications for the continent, it is instructive to examine similar cases where constitutional governance has either collapsed or been restored through institutional resilience. 1. Kenya: Judicial assertiveness and executive pushback. In 2017, the Supreme Court of Kenya stunned the continent when it annulled the presidential election of Uhuru Kenyatta, citing irregularities. The decision was hailed globally as a triumph of judicial independence. However, the aftermath was telling. The executive launched an aggressive campaign against the judiciary, and a fresh election was held with the opposition boycotting. Despite the pushback, Kenya's judiciary maintained a significant degree of public confidence. This was due in part to robust legal community support, media independence, civil society mobilization, international diplomatic backing. Liberia, by contrast, lacks this kind of institutional insulation. The Supreme Court's ruling in Koffa's favor was clear, yet enforcement mechanisms failed, and neither civil society nor international partners acted with urgency or cohesion. 2. Ghana. Parliamentary tensions but judicial compliance. Ghana, widely regarded as a democratic success story in West Africa, offers another instructive contrast. Despite intense political rivalry and frequent legislative deadlocks, especially in the wake of the 2020 elections, which led to a near equal split in parliament, the Ghanaian judiciary has remained largely respected, and its rulings are generally followed. In Ghana, the Electoral Commission and Supreme Court rulings have been contested but not disobeyed, thanks to an entrenched legal culture and consistent international engagement. Liberia's failure to enforce court decisions reveals a structural void that must be addressed through rule of law training, enforcement legislation, and civic education. 3. Tunisia. Judicial subjugation under a constitutional facade. In North Africa, Tunisia, once the beacon of the Arab Spring, has recently seen its democratic experiment falter. President Kais Saied dissolved parliament and restructured the judiciary, effectively stripping the constitutional court of its oversight authority. As of 2025, Tunisia has backslid into an elected autocracy where elections occur, but checks and balances are absent. Liberia now teeters on a similar slope. If court rulings continue to be ignored with impunity, and if the executive consolidates influence over the legislature, the country risks hollowing out its democratic credentials under a veneer of legality. Technology, transparency, and the future of legislative monitoring. Amid widespread political skepticism, digital transparency tools could offer a lifeline for Liberia's fragile democracy. The use of online platforms to track legislative votes, live stream sessions, and publish draft bills can increase public scrutiny and deter unconstitutional behavior. Platforms like Mzalendo, Kenya, and Parliament Watch, Uganda, have transformed citizen engagement by allowing the public to monitor MP attendance and voting patterns, providing summaries and analyses of key bills, exposing discrepancies between campaign promises and legislative behavior. Liberia's legislature currently lacks such mechanisms. Establishing a legislative digital observatory could be a key reform initiative driven by civil society and funded by international partners. Not only would this empower citizens, but it would also restore some credibility to a body long seen as opaque and self-serving. Women and youth as agents of democratic renewal. While the political elite continues to battle for dominance, Liberia's women and youth remain the untapped reservoirs of democratic renewal. Historically, these groups have been at the forefront of Liberia's most pivotal movements, from the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace led by Lema Gbowie to youth-led protests against corruption and poor governance. In the wake of the Koon controversy, youth groups such as the National Youth Movement for Transparent Elections, NAMOT, and women-led coalitions have demanded electoral reforms that ensure equitable representation, gender quotas in parliamentary leadership, youth policy inclusion in the national legislative agenda. However, systemic barriers persist. Political parties continue to field male-dominated slates. Campaign finance remains prohibitively expensive for grassroots candidates, and patronage networks discourage independent or reformist candidates. To shift this paradigm, reform measures should include public financing for women and youth candidates, reserved leadership slots within parliamentary committees, mandatory civic education curricula focused on constitutional literacy. Only through the deliberate inclusion of marginalized voices can Liberia build a resilient, inclusive democracy. A continental call to action, time for a West African Judicial Integrity Pact. Given the increasing trend of judicial defiance and executive overreach across West Africa, Liberia's case should serve as a rallying cry for regional legal and political actors. The African Union's African Court on Human and People's Rights, along with ECOWAS's Court of Justice, must convene a West African Judicial Integrity Summit. Such a summit would establish a regional monitoring mechanism for judicial compliance, create a judicial integrity pact committing signatories to uphold and enforce all domestic constitutional court rulings, launch a public education campaign across West Africa, highlighting the role of courts in sustaining democracy. By leveraging collective accountability, such a framework would raise the political cost of constitutional violations and increase citizen expectations for institutional integrity. Toward a new democratic compact in Liberia. Ultimately, the crisis in Liberia's House of Representatives must not be remembered solely as a chapter of failure, but as an opportunity for democratic recalibration. A new compact is needed, one that redefines the relationship between the executive, judiciary, and legislature based on mutual respect, lawful boundaries, and public accountability. Such a compact must be driven by courageous leadership that places constitutionalism above personal loyalty, a vigilant citizenry that demands transparency and justice, an active media that informs and educates without fear or favor, international solidarity that reinforces, not replaces, local democratic norms. Liberia's post war recovery was built on global goodwill and local resilience. That same combination is now needed to avert democratic regression and chart a path toward sustainable institutional integrity. Political parties at a crossroads, reform or perish. At the heart of Liberia's institutional breakdown lies another deep-seated challenge, the fragility and dysfunction of political parties. The Koon saga revealed how party loyalty in Liberia is increasingly fluid, often dictated not by ideology or policy, but by personal gain, executive alignment, or access to state patronage. For instance, several lawmakers who previously aligned with Koffa's camp defected to the majority bloc after President Boakai signaled his intent to deal with a functional quorum. The absence of internal party discipline or ideological cohesion has made Parliament vulnerable to political manipulation. This trend mirrors party systems in many African democracies. In Nigeria, defections across party lines are frequent and often driven by appointments or patronage access. In Sierra Leone, MPs have faced expulsions and threats for dissenting from their party's executive-endorsed agenda. In South Africa, ANC factionalism has transformed internal power struggles into national crises. If Liberia is to rebuild a functional democracy, it must strengthen party governance. Proposed reforms include requiring parties to publish manifestos and internal constitutions with democratic structures, enforcing anti-defection laws that penalize MPs who switch allegiance without due process, promoting issue-based politics through debates, town halls, and media-led policy reviews. Most importantly, political parties must become vehicles for citizen representation, not mere conduits of elite ambition. Without this, the legislature will continue to be driven by transactional alliances rather than national interest. Reimagining the role of the Supreme Court. The Koffa resignation expose the limitations of judicial authority when court decisions are politically inconvenient. While the Liberian Supreme Court issued a clear ruling affirming Koffa's speakership, the absence of enforcement mechanisms rendered the decision symbolic rather than substantive. This raises critical questions about the structure, independence, and influence of the judiciary. Should the court have powers to enforce its own judgments, including against the executive or legislature? Can Liberia introduce a constitutional court solely tasked with resolving disputes between branches of government? What reforms are needed to ensure that justices are insulated from political retribution, including impeachment threats? Other African countries offer models for consideration. South Africa's constitutional court operates independently, with public support and enforcement credibility. Benin and Cape Verde have introduced constitutional councils that act as arbitration bodies for political legal disputes. Liberia may need to establish a judicial oversight and enforcement unit, possibly in collaboration with the Ministry of Justice, but operationally independent, to ensure that Supreme Court rulings, especially those involving constitutional order, are not dismissed as optional. National dialogue, a pathway to healing. To resolve the current political standoff and prevent future crises, Liberia may need to initiate a broad-based national dialogue involving all stakeholders, current and former legislators, representatives of the executive and judiciary, civil society, leaders, women and youth representatives, traditional and religious leaders, donor and diplomatic observers. This dialogue should not be an elite summit confined to the Capitol building. Rather, it must be inclusive, transparent, and citizen-driven, with the aim of rebuilding trust between branches of government, reviewing the constitutional and legislative framework, setting a national roadmap for institutional reforms and political inclusion. Such a dialogue was key to post-genocide reconciliation in Rwanda, post-crisis reform in Tunisia, and post-conflict political transition in South Sudan, albeit with mixed outcomes. Liberia, with its painful history of civil war and its legacy of resilience, is uniquely positioned to craft a model of homegrown constitutional consensus, bridging the urban-rural divide in democratic governance. A final yet critical challenge exposed by the recent events is the disconnect between Monrovia's political elite and Liberia's rural majority. The constitutional crisis, while significant, was largely viewed as an elite power struggle by rural populations who remain focused on survival issues, access to healthcare, roads, food, and education. Interviews conducted by the analyst Liberia and Bush Chicken in counties like Lofa, Nimba, and Maryland revealed frustration that big men in Monrovia are fighting for chairs, not change. This sentiment underscores a dangerous legitimacy gap. If governance does not translate into real improvement for the majority, it risks becoming irrelevant. To close this gap, constituency offices must be revitalized and properly funded. Civic education campaigns must extend beyond urban centers. The legislature should hold rotational sessions in rural capitals, demonstrating that governance is not Monrovia's monopoly. This is not merely about visibility. It is about equity in political representation and democratizing access to the state. Liberia's democratic journey, at a fork in the road. Liberia's democratic journey, reborn in the ashes of war, tested by corruption, and now shaken by institutional defiance, is at a defining moment. The resignation of Fonati Koffa, the defiance of a Supreme Court ruling, and the contentious rise of Richard Koon collectively mark a stress test of constitutional governance. What happens next will shape the country's political culture for a generation. Will Speaker Koon embrace reconciliation and rule of law, or deepen partisan divides? Will President Boakai reassert the supremacy of the Constitution, or continue to govern through majoritarian expedients? Will the judiciary reclaim its authority, or retreat further into symbolic rulings? Will Liberians, particularly its youth and women, seize this moment to demand reform? Liberia is not alone in facing these questions. Across Africa, democratic institutions are under siege, not from coups alone, but from the slow erosion of checks, balances, and constitutional enforcement. Building a culture of constitutional patriotism. Beyond institutional reform, Liberia must now grapple with a deeper challenge: the lack of a national culture that prioritizes constitutional patriotism over political allegiance. The events surrounding Speaker Koffa's resignation have revealed a troubling norm where loyalty to political blocs or executive power supersedes loyalty to the Constitution and rule of law. This culture is not unique to Liberia. Across Africa, many public servants, elected or appointed, treat constitutional provisions as flexible tools rather than binding legal obligations. In countries like Zimbabwe, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea, decades of this mindset have led to entrenched authoritarianism cloaked in formal democratic processes. In Liberia, however, where the wounds of war are still fresh and democratic institutions are still in their infancy, allowing this mindset to take root could have devastating consequences. The concept of constitutional patriotism, first popularized in post war Germany, refers to loyalty not to party or tribe, but to the principles and processes enshrined in a nation's foundational legal document. To foster such a culture, Liberia must introduce mandatory civic education in all high schools and universities, focused on the Constitution, separation of powers, and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Require newly elected officials to undergo public constitutional oath training, explaining not just what they are swearing to, but why it matters. Empower civil society organizations to monitor constitutional violations and publish quarterly State of the Constitution reports, scoring public institutions on their adherence to constitutional norms. This type of cultural shift takes time, but without it, even the best legal reforms will be vulnerable to political sabotage. A spotlight on the legislature's internal governance crisis. Another critical angle of the crisis is the dysfunction within the legislature itself, which goes beyond the speaker dispute and touches on broader issues of institutional integrity. Internal procedures, committee formations, budget allocations, and staffing decisions have all been marred by political maneuvering rather than merit or process. For example, during the months-long impasse, many lawmakers were suspended without due process, salaries were withheld illegally, and committee leaderships were awarded based on political allegiance rather than competence. These events point to the need for a comprehensive internal legislative reform agenda, including adopting a legislative code of conduct that clearly outlines rules of engagement, decorum, and procedural fairness, establishing an independent legislative ethics office to investigate abuses, including misuse of funds, salary manipulation, and illegal suspensions, conducting an annual independent audit of the legislature's operations and making the results publicly accessible. Without these measures, Liberia's House of Representatives risks becoming a political battlefield rather than a functional deliberative body that represents the will of the people. Revisiting transitional justice and institutional memory. The resilience of a democracy is often tied to how it remembers and learns from its past. Liberia's post-war governance architecture was born out of a transitional justice process that emphasized truth-telling, reconciliation, and institutional rebuilding. However, nearly 2 decades later, many of the key recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, remain unimplemented, particularly those related to governance reform and accountability. The current crisis is, in part, a consequence of this neglect. Transitional justice was not meant to be a one-time project. it was supposed to lay the foundation for a constitutional culture, accountable leadership, and institutional learning. As part of national healing and forward planning, Liberia should revisit the TRC report, particularly the governance and institutional integrity recommendations. Create a national commission on democratic resilience, tasked with tracking lessons learned from political crises and proposing reforms. Include transitional justice education in public administration and law school curricula, ensuring the next generation of leaders internalizes the costs of state collapse and the values of post conflict governance. This process is not about punishing the past, it's about preventing its repetition. The diaspora's untapped power in governance reform, Liberia's diaspora community, spread across the United States, Europe, Canada, and other African nations, played a significant role in the country's post conflict recovery. From remittances and humanitarian aid to political advocacy and investment, the diaspora remains a pillar of Liberia's socio political fabric. Yet their role in governance reform remains underleveraged. Diaspora voices were largely absent during the legislative crisis, not because of disinterest, but due to institutional exclusion and lack of formal representation in decision making. To bridge this gap, Liberia should revisit the debate on diaspora voting rights and legislative representation, establish a Liberian Global Policy Forum where diaspora professionals, scholars, and activists can offer policy guidance and constitutional perspectives. Create a diaspora governance support fund through which diaspora groups can finance rule of law projects, civic education, and judicial training in partnership with local NGOs. The current moment demands not just national action, but transnational solidarity, and the diaspora is uniquely positioned to help drive Liberia's next democratic evolution. A call to vigilance, not despair. As Liberia stands at this institutional crossroads, it must resist the temptation to normalize what just occurred: a Supreme Court ruling ignored, a speaker ousted under pressure, and a political establishment willing to sacrifice constitutional order for factional advantage. But this moment can also become a springboard for democratic renewal if stakeholders commit to learning, reforming, and building on the resilience that has brought Liberia through civil war, post conflict recovery, and two peaceful democratic transitions. It will require a citizenry that demands better, a media that continues to shine light in dark corners, a civil society that refuses to be intimidated, and a leadership across all branches that puts Liberia above party, above bloc, above ambition. Democracy is not defined by elections alone. It is measured by the willingness to lose power gracefully, the courage to uphold the law, even when inconvenient, and the strength of institutions to survive storms of political interference. Liberia's storm is not yet over, but the winds can shift if its people choose vigilance over silence. Reclaiming the People's Parliament toward a legislative rebirth. The essence of parliamentary democracy is rooted in the principle of representation, a legislature that acts as the custodian of the people's will, deliberates on policy, checks executive excesses, and safeguards constitutionalism. What unfolded in Liberia was the antithesis of that ideal: a parliament hijacked by factionalism, paralyzed by defiance of judicial rulings, and compromised by external influence. To move forward, there must be a legislative rebirth centered on a return to principle-based leadership. This involves reaffirming the legislature's independence, not in opposition to the executive, but as a co-equal branch of government. Institutionalizing nonpartisan legislative support structures such as legal counsel, budget offices, and parliamentary research units to reduce over-reliance on party positions. Encouraging MPs to adopt constituency-first approaches, where the interests of the citizens, not party elites, guide their parliamentary behavior. If Parliament is to be taken seriously, it must first take itself seriously. That begins with restoring discipline, transparency, inclusiveness, and adherence to legal norms. Advice to African leaders: uphold the law or undermine the state. Liberia's crisis offers a sobering lesson to African leaders across the continent, presidents, lawmakers, judges, and party elites alike. The deliberate defiance of the Constitution and Supreme Court rulings is not a show of political strength. It is a revelation of democratic weakness. It undermines investor confidence, social cohesion, institutional credibility, and long-term national stability. African leaders must internalize 5 critical lessons. 1. Judicial decisions are binding, not suggestions. The moment a government treats court rulings as optional, it slides toward lawlessness. 2. The separation of powers is not a luxury, it is a safeguard. Executives must resist the urge to dominate parliaments, and legislators must resist becoming surrogates of the presidency. 3. Legitimacy is earned through accountability, not majoritarianism. A majority vote does not legitimize unconstitutional actions. 4. The youth are watching. The next generation is hyper-aware, digitally connected, and increasingly disillusioned by hypocrisy in public office. Disengagement now may breed discontent later. 5. History will judge you sooner than you think. The legacies of Africa's most admired leaders were built not only by policies, but by fidelity to the rule of law, the Constitution, and human dignity. Summary: key messages from Liberia's parliamentary crisis. As Liberia continues to navigate the political and institutional aftermath of the speakership crisis, the following key themes emerge as guideposts for reform and reflection, both nationally and across the African continent. Rule of law is non-negotiable. The Supreme Court must not be defied without consequence. Enforcement of rulings is essential to preserve democratic order. Parliaments must be independent and principled. Legislatures should not become extensions of executive will. They must uphold their constitutional duties with integrity. Civic engagement is crucial. From the grassroots to the diaspora, the public must be educated, involved, and empowered to hold leaders accountable. Institutional weakness is a continental threat. Africa's democratic backsliding is often rooted in the erosion of constitutional institutions, not just in coups, but in constitutional capture. Reform is possible, but requires courage. Leaders, lawmakers, judges, media, and civil society must collaborate to reclaim governance spaces from partisan exploitation. Final words: choosing between power and principle. Liberia's crisis was not inevitable. It was a choice. It was the result of actors placing power above principle, loyalty above legality, and expedience above ethics. The country now has a narrow window to reverse this trend, reclaim its constitutional path, and serve as a model for democratic resilience in West Africa. For Africa at large, the message is clear: democracy without institutions is fiction, and leadership without accountability is tyranny in disguise. To all African leaders, past, present, and aspiring, if you must choose between the Constitution and your convenience, choose the Constitution. Your power may fade, but the rule of law must endure. Only then can Africa become not just a continent of elections, but a continent of justice. If Africa must rise, our leaders must bow to the law. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, amplifying the heartbeat of the continent, one truth at a time. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Subscribe and click the bell, because the next bold voice could be yours.